Rome has declared war, but not in the way that you might expect. Hi everyone, welcome to this channel, and today we gonna look at an episode from the early part of the 1st century BC, where love was set against empire and how the lovers fared. But before we get to the nub of the matter, we need to see how we got there. In our last episode, we saw Antony returning to Rome after his successful campaign against the Parthians. He had achieved a stunning victory over the King of Kings, but it cost him the loyalty of the Roman people. You can check out the details in the last episode, but the upshot was that Antony was seen as having sold out to the east, allying with Cleopatra to take the spoils of the Parthian king. Now, back in Rome, he faced the wrath of Octavian. The two men were once close, but now they were bitter rivals, each vying for control of the Roman world. With the support of the Roman people, Octavian launched a propaganda war against Antony, accusing him of abandoning his wife, Octavia, who was the sister of Octavian, forsaking his children and prostituting himself to Cleopatra. In reality, these charges were likely untrue, or if true, only partially so. But in the context of Roman values and expectations, they stuck. And one by one, Antony's allies abandoned him, leaving him to face Octavian's legions alone. Antony wasn't yet ready to throw in the towel. He still commanded the loyalty of several legions and had significant resources. So when he received a call for help from Cleopatra, he decided to raise an army and march on Rome. That was actually the point at which he crossed the Rubicon and brought the war to Italy, but he never got far. A usurper named Sextus Pompey had seized control of the seas and blockaded the ports of southern Italy. But there was no way that Antony could bring his army north, and even if he could, his officers urged him to make peace with Octavian rather than risk civil war. As a result, Antony agreed to meet Octavian in the northern Italian city of Brundisium to negotiate a settlement. It was a disaster. Octavian refused to negotiate and instead demanded that Antony surrender all of his eastern territories and return to Rome to face trial for his crimes. But while Octavian got the upper hand on land, Cleopatra was having none of it. She had prepared an escape route for Antony through the sea, and once again, Sextus Pompey proved to be a critical ally. He provided a fleet of ships to spirit Antony and his family away to Alexandria. They traveled south through the Mediterranean, eventually reaching the eastern provinces where they established their base of operations. There Antony began raising new armies, but he didn't have the support of the Roman people. His soldiers were mostly mercenaries, and he struggled to keep them supplied. Meanwhile, Octavian was using the money and manpower of the entire Roman world to great effect. Soon enough, he was able to declare full-blown war on Cleopatra and her kingdom. And then, in 32 BC, he sent his general Agrippa to invade Egypt. At first, things went well for the Egyptians. Agrippa landed at Tyre, but the city's defenders fought him to a standstill. Then Agrippa sailed around the coast to Ptolemais, but again he was held up by determined defenders. Meanwhile, Antony and Cleopatra were gathering their forces together. Antony planned to intercept Agrippa's supply ships, cutting off his army from its food supply. But once again, fortune smiled on Agrippa. He was able to resupply his troops and then turn on the Egyptian fleet, destroying it completely. With their navy broken, it was clear that the Egyptians couldn't stop Agrippa from landing in the Bay of Actium. Cleopatra wanted to evacuate to Alexandria, but Antony insisted on fighting. Their combined fleet numbered about 200 ships, while Agrippa had half that number, perhaps less. On the surface, the odds were stacked against them. Even worse, the cavalry wing of the Egyptian army was outnumbered about 3-1. But the Romans were exhausted and low on supplies, and the Egyptians hoped to wear them down. The battle started badly for the Egyptians. One of Cleopatra's commanders panicked and fled, which led to the deaths of many of the Egyptian soldiers. But then Antony took command and managed to turn the tide. His cavalry crashed into the Roman center, nearly routing them. But then Octavian rallied his troops and the attack lost momentum. Soon enough, the Romans were driving the Egyptians back toward the shore. Antony's flagship was damaged, and he ordered Cleopatra to evacuate with their combined forces in full retreat. In the end, the numbers are disputed, but anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 Egyptian soldiers died, along with some 120 ships. On the Roman side, estimates run to about 400 dead, including just 17 ships. Clearly, it was a decisive victory. But while Agrippa pursued the remnants of the Egyptian fleet, Octavian stayed behind to plunder the ships he had captured. Apparently, he had given orders for any captured Egyptian ships to be filled with explosives. But those orders never made it down the chain of command. So instead, Octavian spent the night carousing with his soldiers and celebrating his victory. Now, as we've said before, we have to take these numbers with a grain of salt. Ancient historians often exaggerated the size of the navies they were describing. And even if we discount the numbers, it's clear that the Egyptians suffered a devastating defeat. When news of the battle reached Alexandria, Cleopatra knew that she was in trouble. She immediately dispatched messengers to Athens and Rome, asking for peace. Octavian was willing to listen, but he had terms very similar to what he had demanded of Antony in Brundisium in exchange for peace. He wanted Egypt not as a province, but as a client kingdom. Cleopatra would keep her fortune and her crown, but she would be a subordinate of Rome. Cleopatra hated the idea, but she had little choice. Her messenger arrived in Rome just after Antony did, and as soon as Octavian learned that Cleopatra had come seeking peace, he invited her to meet him in Athens. Everyone suspected that Octavian wanted to marry Cleopatra and take her vast wealth for himself. But he surprised everyone, including Cleopatra, by proposing a marriage alliance. If she married his son Caesarion, she would become the queen of not just Egypt, but of the entire Roman world. She would be the most powerful woman in the empire. All she had to do was agree to end her relationship with Antony. To his surprise, she agreed. We don't know exactly why Cleopatra made this decision. Perhaps she really believed that she could control Caesarion and use him to dominate the empire. Or maybe she just wanted to buy more time to come up with another solution. Whatever her reasons, Octavian agreed to a 3-month engagement period during which Cleopatra would divorce Antony. If she agreed to marry Caesarion, Antony would be allowed to keep his fortune and his life. If she failed to follow through, then everything would revert back to the status quo. When Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, she wasted no time in ending her relationship with Antony. The two were never reunited, but they did fight together. When Octavian invaded, Cleopatra realized that she couldn't beat him in battle, so she tried to lure him into her palace. For 7 years, they fought a war of attrition, but Octavian steadily gained ground until finally Cleopatra's forces fell and he entered the city. Octavian kept his word and allowed Cleopatra to keep her wealth and her life, but Antony was executed on Octavian's orders. History remembers Cleopatra as the ultimate femme fatale, a scheming seductress who destroyed great empires. But in reality, she was simply trying to survive, to protect herself and her people from a hostile Rome. Unfortunately for her, she chose the wrong lover. So if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a like. It will help us to keep making great content. Thanks for watching.